So, and so these are sample views. I don't say that they're totally representative, but the mood certainly in Asia is that the Americans are not what they used to be, and it follows from that, and I'll come back to this in a moment, that the famous Obama rebalancing toward Asia is met, first of all, of course, with a certain alarm here in the Middle East, but in Asia it's met with a certain skepticism. But even at home, back in the United States, there, as I've indicated, there's a great deal of talk about American decline. It's in the more serious journals and magazines, as you can see here, The Atlantic, Foreign Policy, and so forth. So there's a concern, and part of that concern, I think, with respect to the Middle East, arises from the way the American policy toward the Arab uprisings has unfolded. And I don't want to be unkind to the administration, because I think perhaps we would all agree that it is not easy for anybody, even a big power, to try and properly understand what has happened in this part of the world in the last 3 years. But the record has been quite mixed. I think, first of all, in the Tunisian Jasmine Revolution, as it was called, when Ben Ali was overthrown, the Americans kind of held back on that. Tunisia, after all, is not a big, powerful, or strategically located country, and the United States was, I think, definitely surprised by the collapse of the Ben Ali regime, because it had been widely regarded as what we call coup-proof. But it was not difficult, I think, for Washington to say, okay, we can live with that. The Egyptian case, of course, has been much more complicated, and perhaps if we have time in the discussion, there will be some observations from the floor here about it. But it seems to me that in the initial phase, that the Americans were surprised. Egypt, after all, has been the linchpin or a cornerstone of the American strategic architecture for the Middle East for a very long time. And the relationship, there's almost an umbilical relationship between the Pentagon and the Egyptian armed forces. I think the Americans, my guess is that with Mubarak clearly becoming, in a sense, irrelevant to the course of events, the Americans were ready to not to object very much when he was removed, because they may have thought that the Egyptian army will take care of things. And whether it did or not, that's a question that we can talk about. But subsequently, as the United States government, and I think many Americans, have watched with some bewilderment the rather volatile events that have taken place in Egypt, it came to pass that the Muslim Brotherhood government, duly elected, came to power, and the American government said, okay, they were democratically elected, so we deal with them. We might have our reservations about the Muslim Brotherhood and about political Islam, and I think Americans really do, which makes me all the more surprised that there seems to be a widespread feeling here in Egypt that the Americans are actually promoting the Muslim Brotherhood, promoting political Islam as the new thing in the Middle East. I think it's quite hard to believe that. And then finally, of course, with the events of last June and afterwards, the United States again was caught off guard, and we have the current situation, which I understand now, having talked to quite a number of students and professors and friends here in Cairo, that is a very fraught relationship between the United States and Egypt. People that were sympathetic to the Muslim Brotherhood feel that the United States betrayed them, and people that have supported the military. Do I get to use the word? Do I get to use the C word here, or should I avoid that? Okay. Everybody else says it's a coup, but the United States government does not say it's a coup, and we know why that is, because Washington was not sure that it wanted to use a word that would have triggered the cutoff completely of U.S. assistance, economic, but especially military. So whatever it was, the United States was seen by the people, by Tamarrud and by the people that came out very happy, I understand, with what the Egyptian military did. They feel extremely angry with Washington. They feel that Washington was on the other side. So the Americans end up, for better or worse, rightly or wrongly, looking kind of foolish. It doesn't look like they've calculated it right. They always seem to end up in the middle. Everybody seems to be against them. In the case of Yemen, quite a different situation, of course a very complicated one, but I think here we have a case where the United States, despite its presumed hegemony over the Middle East, was not playing a major role. It turned out that if there was going to be effective mediation from outside, it actually came from the Gulf Cooperation Council, and the United States has kind of stood on the side, again perplexed, because on the one hand, the regime of Ali Abdullah Saleh was another link in the security chain of the United States, not nearly as important as Egypt, but important enough and dangerous enough for the United States to invest new military technologies, especially the famous drone unmanned aircraft. So on the one hand, while the regime of Ali Abdullah Saleh tried very hard to be on America's side in the fight against terrorism, on the other hand, I think the American government realized that this was a regime whose time had come, something had to be done, what to do. Again, hard to tell. So once again, the United States doesn't look like it's kind of master of the situation. Turn to the case of Bahrain, where we have the only major uprising in the Gulf. And in this case, once again, it appeared that the Americans were on both sides of the fence. And it appeared on balance that American hypocrisy was never more on display than in the case of Bahrain, where on the one hand, supportive noises were made in support of what I think was thought to be, and maybe still is thought to be, a citizens' uprising against a corrupt and rather brutal monarchy. But at the same time, because there's a major American base in Bahrain, there was an effort made to, again, play both sides. In this case, again, the Americans were not in the lead. They punted, as it were, and left it to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates to come in to help the beleaguered Bahraini regime at least contain the protest. And it was that regime and its local supporters who tried to recast the uprising, not as a citizens' uprising against a bad government, but rather as a sectarian struggle funded by a hostile foreign power, which was Iran. That's a story that's not over yet, because I think that the Bahrain protest has not been fully extinguished. But the Americans, again, are on both sides of the fence. In the case of Libya, well, it finally appeared that the Libyan protesters, those that uprose against the very, very harsh, strange Gaddafi regime, were not likely to overturn turn it on their own. And so it was, there was the interesting question, will somebody from the outside come to help? And in this case, somebody from the outside came to help. It was NATO, led not by the United States, but by the French. And President Obama, when asked about this matter, because he clearly wanted to keep a low profile, even though I am told that American military support was actually quite important in the NATO campaign against Gaddafi, Obama famously said, we choose to lead from behind. Now, leading from behind, it sounds like an oxymoron, actually. My favorite political philosopher, apart from Max Weber, is W.S. Gilbert of Gilbert and Sullivan, who in one of his operas has a duke proclaiming that in enterprise of martial kind, when there was any fighting, he led his regiment from behind. He found it less exciting. And maybe that's unfair, but it seems to me that's sort of where we were. And then finally, and most tragically, we have the Syrian situation where I think the word that Saudi Prince Turki Al Faisal used, I heard him use this word in Washington at a conference last November, the word is dithering. And indeed, you can imagine why, because last summer, when it looked as if after many red lines had been crossed and the pressures were on for some kind of more robust support for the Syrian opposition, very surprisingly, Mr. Kerry dropped a hint that, well, if they would give up their chemical weapons, you know, we would think again. And guess who came to the rescue? Mr. Putin. And the Russians saw an opening. The Russians, I think, have been quite clever in all this. And they said, yes, yeah, we will help with this. And so the whole diplomatic train got diverted onto a siding, as it were, dealing with chemical weapons, which are, of course, are very nasty things, but haven't come close to killing as many Syrians as conventional weapons. And one is just as dead, and the death is just as painful from barrel bombs, from explosives, from sniper fire, etc., than it is from the use of chemical weapons. On balance, though, the symbolic interpretation of all this was that the administration was shooting from the hip. It was fumbling. It clearly didn't want to get involved in any serious way with a military investment in Syria, because in Syria, as in the whole Middle East, the shadow of Iraq hangs over this administration. And that's why, as you can see from Obama's priority list, that the most important thing, the best thing we can do in the Middle East is to reduce our military commitments. So let's not do another Iraq in Syria, even though horrendous bloodshed is taking place there. So it's not, in a sense, it's not a picture of consistency. It's certainly not a picture that the United States can orchestrate or manipulate events in this region at will. Indeed, it appears, as we look at this sort of erratic foreign policy behavior, reactive really, rather than proactive, that the United States has lost its ability to shape events in the region. So overall, just to summarize where we're at, here we have just a few illustrations that give you a clue as to what our priorities have been. We have U.S. military forces in Iraq. We have George W. Bush proclaiming prematurely an end to the Iraqi operation. We have his father earlier on more successfully proclaiming an end to the expulsion of Iraq from Kuwait. We have the administration's resort to new military technologies, drones, Hellfire missiles, because they are less expensive and they do not endanger American military personnel, even though they have a very unfortunate way of killing innocent civilians when they are used, as they have been in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Yemen. And if you thought that the Obama administration was a pacifist administration, and you might, given the fact that they're trying to lower the military profile, the use of drones by the Obama administration was far more extensive than that of the previous George W. Bush administration. So, and then finally, let us never forget that, and I'll come back to this shortly, that in the American domestic political arena, any administration listens very carefully and respectfully to AIPAC. AIPAC is the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. It is the cutting edge of a much larger collection of organizations and groups and funding sources that are in business to make sure that the interests of Israel are fully supported by any United States government. And while we have seen some significant indication that this administration doesn't like the present government in Israel, it still feels constrained to tilt in that direction. So much for U.S. Performance. If we're giving a grade, you can see why we might not want to give Washington an A for this. Now, we will soon come to the conclusions, but I have a couple of other things to say first, and I'd like to talk a little bit about. Let me talk a little bit about Russia and China. As I indicated, Putin and the Russians have taken, I think, an interesting initiative, and Russia's profile, which was certainly an eclipse following the collapse of the Soviet Union, I think has risen in the region. And whether you may not like it, and it may not be very pretty, but the Russians are there. There's a Russian fleet in the Mediterranean, and indeed, as I have just read, your Minister of Defense has been in Moscow and having a very cordial chat with Mr. Putin. And in fact, I understand that Mr. Putin actually nominated Field Marshal Sisi for the presidency of Egypt, even though the Field Marshal himself, I think, has not made a decision on this matter. So I think the Russians are gaining ground. And I think a Syria compromise, leaving Assad in power, which may happen, means a relative victory for the Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, Russia, and behind them, China axis, and a setback, as it were, for what is left of a sort of a U.S.-dependent, moderate coalition of Sunni Gulf-led countries. And I think we now put Egypt under its new management in that category. So if Assad remains, I think that axis, that coalition, will have suffered at least a symbolic defeat. There's also a question of linkage. A decline in the Middle East, or the perception of a decline in the Middle East, may give others elsewhere an impression that the decline is global. And I can give you a little anecdote on this point. I had lunch with an analyst from a Shanghai-based security think tank a few months ago. It was just after Obama had backed off a threat for more robust action in Syria. And he said, when we saw Obama pull back on Syria, he thinks the Chinese leadership thought, well, that means that this is an administration that doesn't have a stomach for really being assertive in world affairs in general, and that means that we can push a little bit harder in the East China Sea. And indeed, it was not long after that China declared a much expanded air defense zone over parts of the East China Sea, which infuriated the Japanese. And the Japanese, in turn, were very disappointed that the United States did not more robustly move to counter Chinese expansion. So there is a problem. It seems that, if I may dwell just for one more second on Asian reactions to this notion of tilting, the notion of rebalancing toward Asia that has been so widely discussed. There is quite a lot of skepticism in China about this, and in fact, I think I have a piece here from the Straits Times, which is the leading English language newspaper of Singapore and Southeast Asia, a few days ago, and their correspondent is speaking about whether, to the extent to which Asia really thinks that it is the beneficiary of more US attention. And of course, Asians on the periphery of China are hoping that the Americans will stand up firmly, because the specter of a rising China in its eastern and southern areas, in the East China Sea, the South China Sea, is something that worries the South Koreans, the Japanese, the Philippines, the Vietnamese, Malaysians, the Indonesians, and even little Singapore. But when the first fruits of this rebalancing have been quite meager. 1,500 Marines were sent to Darwin. Singapore was the site of 4 new littoral landing craft ships, small warships designed for shallow waters like the Strait of Malacca. Terrific, but to most Asian analysts, this seems like really small potatoes. It's really, it really doesn't count for much. And this analyst here in the Straits Times is saying, after Kerry's recent visit to Asia, he says, the new US Secretary of State is finding it hard to convince skeptics in Asia that quantity has translated into quality. For one thing, analysts say, Mr. Kerry's stops in Seoul, Beijing, and Jakarta neither fully assuaged regional concerns about a US policy drift in Asia, nor brought new momentum to efforts to defuse tense territorial disputes in the East and South China Seas. So it's in a way, American policy is being kind of questioned from all directions. Well, all right, how do we explain all this? Well, I think the one thing that we haven't talked about much, which is actually quite important, is that in the United States, as I think many of you know, foreign policy, and especially Middle East foreign policy, is not made in a vacuum. It's not like Metternich with the chessboard of Europe, or Bismarck making clever moves without regard to domestic factors, because there weren't any, but there are in the United States. So I think to explain this uneven, indeed possibly even mediocre performance, you have to look at the domestic political environment. And I think there are a couple of points to be made here. First, I think there's a poor understanding of the region on the part of the decision makers. Leslie Gelb, who's a former journalist who became head of the U.S. Council on Foreign Relations, was interviewed lately, and he said something like Obama's Middle East people are like the gang that couldn't shoot straight, that they don't seem to know what they're doing. And he said that he could not think of a polite word to describe the sort of cluelessness of Obama's Middle East team. So one might suppose that there is a poor understanding of the region. And it's not just the intelligence community within the government. It's not just the CIA and the DIA and the NSA and all of these agencies, although those agencies have not performed splendidly when it comes to predicting Middle East events. The intelligence community misread Saddam Hussein on nuclear weapons and terrorism. It seems to have missed the uprisings of in the Arab world. It seems to have miscalculated Assad's durability, so it's not famously on target. So one wonders, are they really up to speed? But I think it's not just the formal intelligence people. I think we must blame ourselves a little bit for this, because I think more broadly among the think tanks and in the among the academic experts, there has been too much emphasis placed on studying authoritarian persistence and the stability of authoritarian regimes in the region. And there's also been, I think, a tendency, even among some of the think tank analysts, and certainly in the public at large, to demonize Islam. So part of the reason that you saw a U.S. government reluctantly going along with the Muslim Brotherhood, I think, was an attempt, and it's an attempt that had been made by many liberal academics to try to persuade Americans that Islam is not a demon, that Islam is not equated 100% with terrorism. But in fact, there is this broad feeling, I think, to the effect that Islam and political Islam are very tricky and very tricky phenomena that you should be very suspicious of, even if on occasion the United States government will actually use or support certain Islamic movements for its own purposes, as we have seen early on in Afghanistan. So there's that problem of poor understanding at many different levels. And the arrogant assertion among, particularly in the last administration, the George W. Bush administration, about democracy promotion and the possibilities of engineering regime change in a democratic direction seem, in light of the last 3 years at least, to have been quite arrogant and misplaced. You can't really engineer democratic regime change from outside, in my opinion. So there's been a big debate within the administration. Within the administration itself, I think you can identify, as it were, hawks versus idealists. You have realists, such as Ryan Crocker, former ambassador to almost everywhere in the Middle East, where there was a crisis, who is saying, suck it up and live with it. You've got to deal with Assad. We knew that he couldn't be overthrown. Get over it and just deal with it. And you have idealists, certainly in the human rights community and on college campuses and so forth, that are, take a very much different view and who feel that bad leaders ought to be punished, and that the United States should, in its tradition of idealism, which goes back to the founding of the Republic, the United States should still try to live up to its principles of at least setting an example for civil rights, human rights, limited government, et cetera, et cetera. So there's that kind of cleavage. Within the larger political arena, of course, the Obama administration is bitterly opposed by, not just by the Republican Party, but by the most conservative element within the Republican Party, the Tea Party movement, and they are on the warpath. John Bolton, who was a member of that far right community, wrote an op-ed proclaiming that Obama's policies in the Middle East on Iran, Syria, and Israel, Palestine are definitely bound for failure. And when they fail, and Bolton thinks it'll be pretty soon, it will be a catastrophe, not only for the United States, but for the whole region. And then you have public opinion and so forth with their particular slants. One thing, though, that it is interesting to note, if you were wondering why Obama seems to be, in a sense, spineless on some of these issues, one reason is that he's got public opinion behind him. The American public is not keen on further military adventures. The American public wants the US government to pay attention to matters closer to home. So it's not a big problem for him to say, we'll lead from behind. There are plenty of Americans that are very happy to have Obama leading from behind. And above all, the shadow of our misadventures, our military misadventures, our misadventures in regime change in Iraq and Afghanistan hangs very heavily over this administration. Now, maybe they're learning the wrong lessons from history, but whatever that may be, I think the mistakes of the previous administration weigh very heavily on Obama and his advisors. And that includes Kerry, it includes Chuck Hagel, and presumably Susan Rice and others of a more liberal, sort of modest liberal strain. So in conclusion, and I guess it definitely is time to conclude here, let me back off. I've been quite harsh so far, but let me back off a little bit, because I think to his credit, Obama is trying to lower the American military profile and the sort of imperialist image of the past. I think that's to his credit. And I think he's right, although if very late, in finally tackling Palestine and Israel. We thought that after his famous speech here in Cairo that he was going to do this, but he was immediately slapped down by Netanyahu, and he sort of went into his shell, and not a lot was heard until very recently. But Kerry has been really working hard on this. And the latest news, which I actually just saw this afternoon before I came over here, is that Obama himself is said now to be ready to weigh in on Israel-Palestine negotiations and push a security plan, a framework that has been concocted by the Obama team. Well, that's, I regard that as, a positive thing. Recognizing that much of the Middle East is not so important. Even the oil issue isn't so urgent anymore because, as you know, the United States is now producing large quantities of oil and gas itself. So it's not urgent in that sense. And Israel is relatively secure. I mean, Israel, it's always important, Israel, for reasons we've talked about, but it doesn't need much more than it's getting. And of course, the other famous goal of American Middle East policy, which is containing the Soviet Union and communism, that's finished. Although the Russian fleet has come back to Latakia. But no matter. So this is not so bad. And I have to say also that I think the effort to engage with Iran, which were it to be successful, might avoid the distinct possibilities of another war breaking out in the Gulf if Israel were to decide that diplomacy is going nowhere and the Iranians really are militarizing their nuclear capabilities. avoiding another war in the Gulf is not such a bad idea either. So I think we have to give him some credit for that. So finally, I think we have to say, having said that the execution of policy has been pretty mediocre, fumbling, shooting from the hip, dithering, as Prince Turkey so sharply put it. And it's hard for the superpower accustomed to owning the Middle East to have to share it with others, and even to put up with the Russia, China, Iran, Syria axis. And with the decline of US influence and the continuing chaos in the region, which, as you know, is fed by poor economic conditions in the populated areas, the threat of extremist terrorism, with an Islamist face usually, remains. And one can think of all sorts of worst-case scenarios, but one certainly would be that, that in the future Al-Qaeda would become resurgent in places that are essentially ungoverned or ungovernable, and even to the point where one might see the collapse of Saudi Arabia, the regime in Saudi Arabia or other Gulf states. That would be a problem. John Mearsheimer, whom I quoted at the beginning, who said we ought to contract our strategic goals and be a little more parsimonious in choosing what's really important to put our resources into, he said essentially, the Middle East as we know it is not all that important anymore. Egypt is not so important. Israel-Palestine is not really so important. Oil is not as important, but it's important enough that the United States should confine its strategic, the application of strategic power to that particular area and not to the broader region. I don't know how people might feel about that, but we will have a chance to hear from you in a moment. So finally then, it's time to give the administration a grade. I say a C. What do you say? And I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Frank.